So today we're going to do a quick presentation. I'm hoping it'll last about 45 minutes, and we're going to do a quick case study on OCTranspo and how we created a holistic and integrated transit network through wayfinding and place branding. So like I said, we're hopefully going to last about 40 to 45 minutes. And then at the end, if there are any questions, you can put them in the chat, and then I'll select a few questions and we can go through those as we go. So I'll just get started. So today, like I said, we'll look at OCTranspo. This is a project we worked on. We started quite a while ago. I think now it's been 3 to 4 years we actually started this project, and it's actually in place now. So as we go through today, I'll show you a bunch of photos and the work that we did to get to where we are today. So just to give you a little bit of background, I am Vincent Gratton. I work at Entro Communications, and I've been at Entro for about a little over 15 years, but I have about 20 plus years of experience in graphics, wayfinding, industrial design. And my background is mostly in industrial design. And I also studied engineering before that, and funny enough, mathematics. But what's interesting is all those trades seem to be applicable when you start looking at projects such as this one. So moving on. So like I said, I'm a partner at Entro, and we're located in Toronto. We're based in Toronto, but we have offices in Calgary, New York, Zurich, and Sydney. And I just wanted to give you guys a little bit of background on who Entro is so that I can set up the context for this presentation, and so you can understand the steps that we took. So here's our team. This is the Toronto office. I think we have more people now. I'm over here, if you recognize me. And this photo is about a couple of years old. So we now have some new members in our team, and we've also expanded since this photo was taken. We have an office in Australia, and we also have our New York office. And what we do at Entro is we like to say that we connect people to places, and we like to give identity and meaning to places. And one of the taglines we use is to make everyday experiences inspirational. And that could be through a variety of means, whether it's graphics, whether it's signage, placemaking, etc., which we'll cover some of those things today. And another thing we like to say is we work on things as small as a postage stamp. So this is a Diwali stamp that we had designed a little while ago, but we go as big as actual cities. So this is Roosevelt Island in New York. It's a park, but we've actually also done entire city wayfinding programs and identity programs. So it's really kind of a breadth of small to as large as you can really go when you think about it, because it's placemaking, and every place has some type of identity that they try to get across. So we like to say that we lie at the intersection of the environment, products and services, and the corporate strategies. So we lie kind of in the middle here for experiential design, where all these things kind of meet and play into the solutions that we come up with. And a lot of people think of signage and wayfinding and so on, and they think it's just signs and making pretty signs and getting people around. But really, it's something that speaks to the brand of a place, and it's not necessarily unidirectional. It speaks to one another. So the wayfinding has to respect the place brand, and the place brand also has to relate to the wayfinding, in addition to many other things. But today we'll mostly concentrate on these two things. So these are some of the sectors that we currently work in. So you'll see there's quite a few, everything from civic, urban, to airports, transit, educational areas, sports and entertainment, stadiums, office spaces, mixed use. So there's quite a few sectors that we work in, and there's quite a few disciplines too that we have at the office that we make use of when we work on some of these sectors. And we do design of identity, wayfinding, like I mentioned earlier. We even do interpretive exhibit design, thematic, donor recognition, and public art. But today we're going to focus on transit for OCTranspo. And funny enough, transit really makes use of all the disciplines that we have at our company. So everything from research to neuroscience. We even have a doctor of neuroscience that helps us set up workshops and things like that to get the most out of our stakeholder engagements and so on. And in terms of the design aspect, The transit project usually has to do, in this particular project, dealt with the identity, wayfinding signage. We dealt with a lot of theming and a lot of public art programs as well that we had to consider. So just to give a little bit of background on Entro, we've done quite a few transportation projects. These are just some of the more local ones, maybe other than BC Transit. So everything from Zoom in Brampton to the TTC, the new Metrolinx lines that are opening up. You might be familiar if you're from Toronto or from the Toronto area. Up at north of the city, there's a new Viva dedicated busway. And we've done a lot of work for GO, Union. So you can see we have quite a breadth of local experience, which helped us in this project. And we also work on a lot of international projects as well to do with transit. So you'll notice that here I'm just showing an example. We also do standard manuals for transit agencies. So how they can implement signage, wayfinding, and branding. So we've done that for quite a few transit agencies. We've also done a lot of work. This is signage and wayfinding for the My Way in Mississauga. So just showing a few examples of how we would do bus signs and things that are replaceable. You'll notice that if you look at number 26, that whole blade is actually replaceable. So it allows for easy maintenance and operations as the system evolves in the future. And we've also done a lot of connecting transit entities like Up Express. This is a train that connects the airport to downtown Toronto. So we've done a lot of their stations, identities, worked with their identities and how it gets implemented at their various sites. Here's the Brampton Zoom project. Here we just had a hand in helping on how to apply their new brand to their existing system, especially shelters and so on. And then obviously we have Union Station, which is downtown Toronto, where it's a big hub where all the transit entities kind of meet up. And we did a lot of work at Union Station, and it's quite an extensive station that's large and has a lot of connections. And we even do things such as interiors, branding of transit entities for interior bus, exteriors, their stations, shelters, et cetera, et cetera. And we even look at some of the fare equipment machines and trying to tie that into the various brands that we work with. So you see here the One Ride machine is the one that we had a hand in developing for Viva. So just now that we've looked at a little bit of background, I wanted to get into the topic at hand, which is OCTranspo. So as an overview for OCTranspo, it's in the city of Ottawa, Canada's capital. And at the time we started the project, it carried about 97 million riders annually. And there's a lot of tourists and a lot of locals that come through Ottawa. So, so it's good to consider both those user types. And if you see here, daily trips were at about 340,000 a day when we started the project. And obviously some of these numbers have been significantly affected since COVID, but before COVID hit and when the system was implemented, we did see a significant increase in ridership. And I'll take you through the project and try to explain what helped increase that ridership. So here's a pretty picture of Ottawa. In the background, you'll see the Parliament. We have our fancy hotel on the side. And this is one of the most busiest intersections in Ottawa with Rideau Street. There's also a street here that has all the embassies and so on. So it's really the central station for Ottawa, or the central area of Ottawa. However, their transit system extends all the way to the outskirts of the city. And currently they had a train, they had what was called an O-train, and they also had bus systems. But all of these different systems that they had were a little bit disjoint, and I'll take you guys through a little bit how we brought those all together. So some of the project goals we had was to make sure that the system we were developing was user-centered, and that it addressed all the connectivity across the different modes of transportation. So if you were going, for example, from a bus to a train, or from a bus to another mode of transportation, that there was consistency across those connections from a branding and messaging point of view as well. Because you can imagine if someone goes from one system to another, and if all the aesthetics of the signage, the messaging, and the verbiage that's used changes, it can really cause some confusion for users. So we wanted to make sure that that was seamless and intuitive. and also that everything was architecturally integrated. We often see transit systems where it does appear that a lot of signage and wayfinding is slapped on. It's done as a last minute addition. So we wanted to make sure that it was fully integrated because this project also involved the design of new stations across the entire system, as well as updates to existing infrastructure. And also we obviously took into account accessibility and inclusivity to make sure that the system was accessible to everybody. And also things like maintenance and operations. So how could we help the city reduce their costs as they went forward, which nobody likes to think about, but it's one of the main considerations that we did look at. So we really wanted to take a holistic approach. And so one of the first things we wanted to do was look at their branding. And I'll go in more depth in the next few slides, but you'll see later on that there was a bit of confusion with respect to the branding that was associated with the transit agency and with kind of ancillary agencies and other agencies that you'd see the brand of as you rode through the system. So the first step is really we wanted to conduct a full system assessment, look at how people behave. So not just an audit and an assessment of the products, but an assessment of how people currently behave on the system and if there's any gaps or areas of improvement. So we also wanted to define a master system identifier. So essentially a brand for the system that would cover all the different modes of transportation, regardless of where they were located. So if they were below grade, above grade, or if they were street stops. Another pretty complex thing that we did for this project is we were looking at the existing route structures. So how does Ottawa currently handle all their bus route numbering, their route structures, their mapping strategies, and so on. So that was another area that we focused on. And we talked a little bit about the wayfinding placemaking, which I'll get into. And it also included us making some recommendations for digital displays and how we can integrate technology to help them operate. And if you're not familiar with PIDs and TIPs, this is passenger information displays and transit information panels. So like I said, the first step we did is we looked at doing a system audit. So we looked at all the different types of stations. We looked at the patterns of pedestrian flows. We also did some workshops, some online surveys and some intercept surveys with people riding the system. We looked at the different types and modes of transportation they had, how people made transfers and payments. What were the peak times, the normal times, what different types of routes did they have, and who was using the system and where were they using it? So at the major hubs, at tourist destinations, and so on. So really it's a matter of looking at things from the first mile to the last mile. So we looked at what's the first thing that people do when they're planning their trip is they go typically either online or they might go to a station and try to figure out how they're actually going to get to where they're going to. So we have the trip planning aspect. And then we have the first mile where people may arrive at a station, excuse me, and then they would depart from a station or a stop, but they'd have to locate where that stop is. Then they would have to board, then they would be in the process of riding the system. They may have to make a connection, and if they do, then at the end they arrive at their final destination. And it might seem obvious to lay this out this way, but you'll see that for each of these steps, there are certain types of branding identity, signage, wayfinding that's really specific to each one of these steps. So as I said, the first thing that we did is we sent some people out to ride the system for a few days. And it's not always the funnest task for people to do, especially during rush hours when we really want to get the important information that we're trying to extract from our site visit. So you'll see on the left-hand side, this is Dave Wilkinson from our office who had the pleasure of riding the system back and forth for a few days. And the way that we did that is we actually gave him some tasks. So we would give him, for example, a destination that's at the outskirts of the city and tell him that he had to get to that destination via a certain route that had transfers or whatever the case may be. So we tried to basically simulate, excuse me, simulate different types of passengers and types of routes and travel destinations that a typical person would take, whether they be a local, a tourist, or a day tourist, someone who's just coming in from across the river from another city. So there's a lot of different types of users that we had to consider and how they behave on the system. So you'll see from this slide, we also did a lot of observational studies and trying to gather what other gaps we may find in the system or problems. So one of the other tasks is even at street stops, we looked at mapping. We did an assessment of if buses were on time, how long it took, how we identify those buses, and whether or not it's clear where those buses are going to or where the trains are going to, et cetera, et cetera. So here I think he was measuring some light with a light meter, I believe. So. And we also sent another person out who basically mimicked a different type of passenger. So you might have a tourist or you might have a local. So they're very different types of trips that people make depending on how they're using the system and what type of user they're using. So we tried to mimic all those different types of users. So one of the very first things that we started looking at for OCTranspo was a brand hierarchy. So as a person rode through the system, so as our people rode through the system, we asked them to look at what brands they came across as they rode the system. And we wanted to make sure that once we had a grasp on what brands are being used, that we can make sense of them so that it's clear for people what system they're riding, and when they make transfers, that it's also clear that they're getting onto another mode of transportation, but it's part of the same system. And that's really essential that we look at brand hierarchies in order to make sense of all of that. So as a person traveled in Ottawa through their transit system, you'll see this page that I'm showing here has a whole bunch of brands on them. And these are essentially all the brands that someone may come across as they rode the system. And you can see it's quite extensive, and not all the brands that are shown here have to do with transit or transportation. Just as an example, you might have a taxi. So you might arrive at a certain station, and within that station, they may have this brand. And what we noticed was there was no clear hierarchy. So as a person traveled, it wasn't clear whether are they on OCTranspo? Is this the brand? Is it called the Confederation line or the Trillium line? Is it called the O-Train or the Transitway or Paratranspo? And these are all part of the OCTranspo, but different either modes of transportation or different types of services. So the O-Train is a heavy rail that was already existing. Confederation and Trillium were the two new lines that they were building that we were working on. And then we had to make sure that all the other modes of transportation followed suit with whatever we came up with for Confederation and Trillium. The Transitway, interestingly enough, Ottawa was one of the first cities that had a dedicated busway, which is really great. So that was something that we needed to integrate within the whole wayfinding system. And then we had the Paratranspo, which was accessibility transportation. And then all the brands you see underneath basically had to do with either services available at these different stations and different modes, or had to do with other services, like I said, with taxi, or you might be getting on a Greyhound bus and so on. So it was important for us to consider all these connections that don't necessarily have to do with OCTranspo, but that people will in fact be transferring to or using those other logos. So what we did is we looked at all these brands and tried to basically make something that makes sense from a hierarchical point of view. So we started looking at what is the master brand, what are the sub-brands, the services, the related service offerings, and so on and so on. And then based on these, we basically created a hierarchy to try to make sense, even for ourselves, before we delved into the task of coming up with a new system identifier. So I'm kind of giving away the secret here, but the system identifier in the end became this O, and it might seem so simple to use the O, but there was a lot of brand equity that was taken from this O. People that were local already knew the O from their heavy rail line, which included that O. But OCTranspo, which is kind of the master brand, if you will, the transportation agency that handles everything, also made use of that O a little bit. So we thought there was a lot of equity in that O that we did not want to lose. So we thought to make use of it and transfer it from the heavy rail line over to the master brand, and then start thinking about how these other modes fit underneath that master brand. And you'll notice here we have buses because there was no brand for just the bus line. So this helped us identify some gaps as well that existed. So here's a quick image of the final brand that was implemented for the system, identity. So this is just an example of one of the signs that they have outside of the station, and it's a vacuum formed sign, so it's very three-dimensional, and it's illuminated at night. So it's really something that's very obvious, and once you see it, you know what it is because of that equity was there. And then underneath that, we had the different services that are available at that station, whether that be buses or trains or heavy trains, heavy rail, etc. So that was part of that strategy. And then at the station entrances, you'll notice that we had signage obviously identifying the station names. The reason I brought up this slide though is just to show you that in downtown Ottawa, there are quite a few stations that are in very busy areas and there's not much real estate that you can work with. So one of the solutions that was come up with for these stations was to use these lantern type monumental signs, and essentially they would light up at night, and we had kind of that cropped O on the side still to convey that brand identity to people. So another thing that we looked at for Ottawa was their mapping and their route structures. So here is an image of the existing map that was in use at the time we started the project. So needless to say, it's very complex, and people usually looked at it and gave up rather quickly, especially if you were not from Ottawa and if you didn't know how these maps were to be used. So you'll notice not only is it quite extensive in information, but it can get quite crowded too. So you'll notice down at the bottom, they've taken the downtown area, which has more services, and kind of zoomed that in so that you can see what was going on. And this was meant to be used as an overall system map. Obviously at stations, we had more condensed versions, but one of our tasks was to look at this map and see how we could simplify it and make it more user-friendly. So this is the final version of the map that we developed, and it took a lot of work to get here. So when I go from here to there, it might seem very simple, but it was actually quite a complex task. One of the main strategies that we used to develop this new map was to make sure that we were using straight lines. So if I compare this to the previous, you'll notice all the streets are shown on this map, all the little turns and that someone would make as they go down one of the systems are shown. So this is a geographically accurate map, but we don't necessarily need to have that level of detail in a transit map. So one of the things we did is we tried to come up with some preset kind of angles that you could show these things. So you'll notice that there's only a few different types of angles that we're using with the map. And we tried to use those to make the routes much more simple to read and to follow. And we still used kind of these call outs to identify which buses and which types of connections are available at each of the various stations across the network. One of the other things that we did is we thought there was a lot of equity in the current bus numbering system. So if you can imagine someone who's lived in Ottawa for 30 years and they're always taking the bus number 31, and then one morning they wake up and that all of a sudden has changed. So that could upset a lot of people, especially locals that are very used to the system. So we tried to think of ways that we could retain that equity of existing bus numbering and existing organizational, the organizational system of the entire transit network. So what we did is we started looking at dividing the city into essentially these sectors. So like I said earlier, if somebody was used to taking the number 30 bus and lived, say, for example, in Orleans, what we decided or what we suggested was to make them 3-digit bus numbers. So the first digit would represent any bus or any transportation system that goes within Orleans, this little area here, would start with the 3. And then we could retain some of the older existing bus numbers, 2-digit bus numbers, by using those 2 free digits. So that was really something that we thought was good for the system because of that equity that was already there. And it also really helped people even from a tourist perspective, because if you knew you had to go to a certain part of the city, you knew that for example, any 400 series bus would eventually get you to whatever area was designated for those 400 series. So we thought that that was quite a good system. And then another thing that we had to look at was how do we identify all the stops, the stations on those maps, and not only on the maps, but on the street signs, at the stations, et cetera, et cetera. So we did a few studies on how different routes could be displayed. So for example, Ottawa had different types of routes. They had a rapid, a local, a frequent, and connections. So we wanted to make sure we differentiate those through colors and through shapes as well, because earlier I mentioned we had to look at accessibility, and oftentimes shapes can help people distinguish the different levels of service. But there are also other things on maps, especially on the maps, looking at what's a starting point or a terminal station? Is there a limited route that only goes certain times of the day or certain areas? And where's the terminal point? So we tried to graphically represent those on a map as well. And it can get quite complex when you look at these, and you may wonder, do people really understand what they mean? But when you see it on an overall system map, it starts to make a lot more sense. So even from a street stop point of view, we looked at how we could apply those lozenges, if you will, or those shapes to the street signs using kind of minimum sizes that would be legible, essentially. So you'll see these are actually quite large, and it was a big improvement from what Ottawa used to use. And I'll show you some photos of some existing examples that might help you gauge kind of how it's changed in the past little while. So again, you can see the reason I bring these up again is we've replaced all these lozenges that they had with new ones that really help define and make a user understand if they're in the middle of a line, if they're at an end station, if a transfer is available from that station, et cetera, et cetera. So another thing I wanted to just take a quick look at was the actual signage. So one of the things that we like to do here at Entro, and unfortunately we didn't do it for this particular project, but I still wanted to include it for this presentation because it's quite interesting, especially in today's world. This seems even more applicable, and I'll show you why. We like to do what's called pedestrian flow modeling. So I'll just play this quick little video. So this is a sample station. So you can essentially just program agents, which are the little people you see on this plan view. And obviously a station would never be this busy. We just did this just to show a representation. But you can start planning out how users move through a space. So, and depending on where you apply either place branding, signage, wayfinding, how that might impact all of these flows. And you can imagine that, for example, if we were to put a sign where all this congestion is occurring, that would probably not be a good idea because you're increasing the congestion. So although pedestrian flow modeling is great, it doesn't give you necessarily some of the solutions that you can come up with and then put those through the program. So I have another model here that I'll play quickly. So this is just, again, a sample space that we created just to give an idea of how pedestrian flow modeling is used. So you'll notice a bus at the end here. And if we imagine that this is a station, obviously it's not fully developed. As you can see, there's empty spaces. But if you imagine this might be a retail space, there might be a fare payment area zone that's over here. And then you can start seeing how people move through that space. And you can program each one of these people to behave in a certain way. So if you know that 10 people 10% of the people going through the stations typically get lost, you can program that right into the flow modeling. So you can really get quite accurate results on how people move through spaces by using this tool. And it really is only a tool. It's like a pen. It helps you kind of design, it helps you get to the design that you want to be. It doesn't necessarily design for you, but what it does do, and you can ignore all the zombie-like characters in here. We didn't give different characters, but you can see how people would move through a fare gate zone, how they would maybe get lost. And once you have that, you can actually start to generate these heat flow maps. So as I move through, or as the users move through the space, you can get a good sense of where there's hotspots. So all of the red areas means that there's more circulation and more people going into those areas. So this could be a really great tool to help determine where to put signage, and also if the placement of signage, wayfinding, graphics, and digital elements might have a trickle effect, and which is very important. Because imagine if you put a sign over here, it might have an impact at the entrance of a station, but you would never know that unless you modeled it and with the numbers of people you would expect to ride the system. So it's a really useful tool that we're using more and more, and especially with COVID around, this is a tool that we've used as well, just to, even to look at the distances between the users and how that impacts the operations of various transit facilities. So moving on. So how does that apply? Sorry, I'm just having, there we go. So how does that apply to signage? So one of the things we did for OCTranspo is put together a standards manual for them. So as they develop in the future, there's no questions on how they apply graphics, signage, wayfinding, the nomenclature associated with stations, and so on. And how that also gets applied to existing new stations and existing infrastructures such as shelters. So here's a few photos of what Ottawa, what the signage program in Ottawa looked like before the intervention. So you'll notice that there's really a lack of consistency. There's maybe somewhat of a consistency with maybe some of the fonts and the colors being used, but you'll notice that the application of these various types of identity signs are different from station to station, even at shelters. And there's no kind of unifying graphic element that ties all of these things together. So this was part of our initial assessment, is to figure out where those gaps lie. So some of the other signs that exist already, we talked a little bit about the transit way, they had a dedicated busway. So you'll notice that here, even that brand Hierarchy is being a little bit distorted because OCTranspo was the main brand, but then Transit Way was a sub-brand. But we thought that this may cause a little bit of confusion for riders if they're not familiar with the system. So going back to our big O that we presented earlier, this really helped tie in. So regardless of the mode of transportation, whether it was heavy rail, light rail, buses, and so on, all of the stations received these O identifiers, which really helped bring the whole system together and unify everything. And I think the people of Ottawa too were already familiar. Like I said, there was some equity associated with this O. So it wasn't a big shock for people that lived in the area. And it was more of a subtle change that didn't really change the behaviors of the locals, but that really helped to clarify the system as a whole and to help people navigate through the system. So I have a few additional images here of some of the station entrances. So you'll see some of the lantern images, which we worked with some of the architects that worked on the station designs. And I neglected to mention earlier with the big O, that was also an exercise, a branding exercise that Entro did with Terry Hurd designers. So we worked in collaboration and came up with this big O, and even different graphic applications. You'll notice here that it's composed of a bunch bunch of smaller O's. So it was a nice way to kind of evoke that notion of movement, of being dynamic. And we've even applied this to shelters and so on. And even cropping this O, you can crop it in several ways and you still get the sense of what that O is. So it's really, really flexible in terms of the application of that O. Because if you imagine if we had come up with another type of logo, oftentimes there's limitations on how a logo can be used in physical environments and on sites, but this really gave us a lot of flexibility to use it in various ways. And you'll even see at the entrances, those O's were identified as well, along with the lines and the different modes of transportation available at that station. And keep in mind, all these images were during construction. So you'll notice there's nobody in these photos. And these also were not the final conditions. This was the first prototype station, I believe. So that's why there's nobody here. It's a cordoned off area. So we just thought it was a good opportunity to go take a photo, and just because it's probably never going to be this empty ever again. So. And then I mentioned earlier for areas that were confined with respect to space. So obviously with lanterns, we couldn't just areas. So we came up with different ways of how those white lanterns could be applied if we were limited with either sidewalk space or just general space for each station. But at every location, we did have this O with the post. However, we noticed that in downtown locations, this post caused some problems with respect to accessibility. And there's already a lot of elements, as you can see, there's benches, garbage cans, parking meters, light standards. So adding more elements like more posts in those busy areas may not be the best solution. So we looked at other ways, which I'll show you in a little bit, of how that O could be applied. This here is just an example of how they used to display their route number. So you can see that it can be quite confusing. So you have the route numbers at the bottom, and then you have the route names at the top. So it really demands the users to try to associate the name with the route number. So it might be easy, the first one, 95 is Blair, but when you get down to, say, Tunney's Pasture, which bus number is associated with Tunney's Pasture? And literally someone would have to count 1, 2, 3, 4, the fifth one. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 27 is Tunney's Pasture. So we thought that there were a lot of improvements that could be made in this system. So we started looking at all their street signage, their bus transfer signage. And what we wanted to do is, because they were keeping their existing infrastructure at certain locations, we needed a solution that basically just replaced their graphic panels. So by reorganizing all the information with the strategies that I've been talking about previously, we basically laid out a new way of displaying that information where it was much easier to make that association as to the name of the route with the route number, and as well with the shapes and the different lozenges that were used for the various buses and systems. And that extended, like I said, to the street stops. This was for bus loops and bus connections. And then at other stations, we also had different types of signage as well. So you start to see how this is finally kind of getting unified when you're comparing it to the existing system, where it might be a little bit confusing, not only for the association, but for even the colors being used. What do they mean? What's the difference between green, red, black, or gray with an outline? So really, we wanted to make sense of all of that for OCTranspo. Another really important thing that we did was to try to set some standards on how organizationally, how the signs could be laid out. So you'll notice here we used certain areas and certain spaces for the use of accessibility symbols, ticketing. So we helped OCTranspo develop all the consistent pictograms that are obviously internationally recognized, and to come up with a standard way to display the information on signage so that from one station to the next, it is consistent. So somebody who's used to using the system or who's new always knows exactly where to look. So for example, if they're looking for the accessible route, the accessible symbol is always the first item, regardless of where your arrow is, it's always beside the arrow. So it becomes very, very intuitive for users. And it's also important maybe to keep in mind that this was a system that had to be both in English and French. So making use of pictograms in that case is very useful because French and English can get quite long when you're trying to display messages on signs, especially considering that French messaging is typically about 30 to 35% longer than English messages. So here's another station entrance, and I wanted to show this to just simply showing the different connections that are available at stations. One of the things we also worked with OCTranspo was finding a way if we could integrate some of these egress messages within the signage. So we are doing that for other transit systems, but currently not in Ottawa for all the stations. Here's an example of a surface level stop. So this is a good example of where someone may come off the bus and make a connection. You'll see in the background here, there's a PIMSI station, another station where someone, if they got off the bus, would need to be able to make that connection and understand that this station actually belongs to this system as well. And then just as a, excuse me, a general shot, again, this is during construction of the stations, but you can really see how that identifier really stands out. And it does tie in with the overall kind of modern look with the new stations, with the new lanterns and so on. So earlier I had mentioned for areas, so for example, in a downtown area, we might have limited space to put signs or post-mounted signs. So one of the solutions we came up with for those particular areas was to do building mounted signs. So it's essentially exactly the same thing, except it's just surface mounted. And it might seem like an easy solution, but there's a lot of coordination that goes along with this because the building itself may not have been owned by OCTranspo. It might be a private ownership. So we had to coordinate with those private owners and with all the stakeholders on how we could integrate these elements within their building or within the system as in general. So as a last item, once the system was done, we actually had a quick video made, just identifying just a high-level overview of the system. We went and spoke to some of the representatives from OCTranspo. So I'm just going to play a quick, I think it's a 3-4 minute video. And then after that, I think it'll pretty much be done and we can go to questions. So hopefully you can all hear.
The opening of the new O-Train line here in Ottawa is a really big change for the City of Ottawa. It's a city building, very forward-looking decision that City Council made 9-10 years ago to do this work. So we're having a complete transformation of how people travel from different parts of the city to and through downtown.
A unified look and feel for a transit system is critically important. Design has to be, in a lot of ways, very simplified. And we have to really distill down to the core essence of what an identity can end up being. So there's that level of continuity of message. And here at Entro, we develop place brands. And a place brand is more than just a graphic. It is a series of guiding principles that is the connective tissue that unifies the space through wayfinding, identity, and storytelling.
After we did a system audit for OCTranspo, we developed a set of guidelines for the signage and wayfinding program. We also came up with recommendations for renumbering the route numbers, coming up with new service levels, redeveloping the system map, and OCTranspo took all of these recommendations and they implemented change with them.
Those design elements are going to help people navigate a space or identify with the space or understand a story. So it can be many different sort of scenarios. And primarily we do that through graphics.
The O is a really strong symbol. It's something that, you know, is easily recognizable from a distance. It's easily legible regardless of which way you look at it from. VOs at the station entrances were kind of a big statement that were meant to kind of draw you towards the station entrances. And we tried to make it a playful element. We cropped it and tried to give it a sense of movement to really draw you towards those entrances.
One of the big elements that Ottawa focused on was really kind of cleaning up the older stations and bringing them up to speed, making them look a little bit more modern and unified with the rest of the system. So I would say that now when people ride the system, they feel a bit more confident. The system's now a bit more intuitive. So that's the real goal, and how people's behaviors, we feel, have changed with the new implementation of the new brand.
We're really happy that Entro was able to help us, and it's really put us on a solid footing that our own internal team can continue to keep high quality signage and wayfinding and information available for our customers in years to come.
All right, so that was the video, and I think that brings us to the end of the presentation. Oh, good timing, 12:45. So we have about, I guess, 10 minutes or so for any questions. So let's see. One of the questions that came up was what level of stakeholder engagement was done to assess some of the final solutions, and that's always a big question, especially when you're looking at a transit network where your stakeholders are essentially the entire city, all businesses, all people that live in the city. So I think doing that first system audit and that system analysis where we sent people to ride the system and ask people questions was really valuable. But one of the things you have to be careful with these system audits is what time of the year we went. So you'll notice from the photos that I was showing that many of these site audits that we did were done during colder months, and even the people's behaviors change depending on what season it is and what time. So we also made use of a lot of information that we got directly from OCTranspo just to make sure that we were addressing some of the stakeholder engagements that they had, or information that they had related to their stakeholders during all times of the years, not just during winter or summer months. So essentially though, we like, when it comes to stakeholder engagement, we usually set up quite a few groups, and we typically keep them separate because they all have different initiatives and goals in mind. So rather than getting all these things mixed up, we would kind of keep these groups separate and assess based on individual groups rather than all groups together, because that can cause a lot of arguments often. So hopefully that answers that question. Another question here was, how can you assess if the final design and implementation has been successful on items that may be subjective in nature, which is actually a really good question. Things that are subjective, are often hard to assess whether you've been successful or not. And that is one of the reasons we did all those stakeholder engagements, surveys, so that we could do essentially a post-mortem once the project was completed, so that we could go back and assess if behaviors have in fact changed, if ridership has gone up. And we did, in fact, see that there was a positive feedback on the new system. So that's one way to get to assess a subjective, I guess, a subjective project. But another way is I showed you earlier some of the pedestrian flow modeling. These are also ways, excuse me, that as you work through a project, that you can vet some of the subjective solutions that you might come up with to try to assign some objective data to that subjective element, so that you could use it to vet your solutions, and also to sell to the client, to basically explain to the client why the solutions you're coming up with are good solutions. Let's see here. There's a third question here. It's how do transit agencies respond and adapt quickly to changing situations? So that's a common question, I think, for all transit agencies. One of the things that we do when we work with transit around the world is we make sure that there's some level of flexibility for the system. And OCTranspo is actually a really good example of that, because right now OCTranspo is developing another line. So if you imagine the existing line might have the names of end stations, for example, displayed on certain signs. But as soon as they add a new station, it has a trickle effect back to the very first station. So you have to make sure that you build in some level of flexibility and adaptability in the existing system so that messages, pictograms, signs can easily and cost efficiently be changed out. And so that's something that we always look at, and we typically make all our sign faces replaceable so that you don't have to take an entire sign down, or that there's some level of modularity associated with the products that we recommend. So I think that answers that question. If there's any more questions, feel free. Maybe I'll wait just a few seconds to see if any more come in. And if not, though, maybe I'll take this opportunity just to say thank you for all those who are in attendance. And if there's any questions, like I said, put it through here. We also have a website. If you had any questions or anything you were curious about, feel free to send an email. We're quite good at responding to those. So yeah. So it looks like that. Oh, here comes a question. How has the nature of signage and wayfinding changed since the pandemic? Yes, that's a big question. We've done a few webinars that speak to that topic, and we have noticed there's been a huge decline. I think in some instances, I think there's been up to an 80% decline in the use of transportation. And it's really, it's a tough question. One of the things we have looked at potentially using is some of that pedestrian flow modeling that I've shown you earlier to determine how the impacts of COVID and social distancing might actually make its way into a station. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a trickle effect. And this even ties back to an example I often use, has to do with airports. If you imagine a flight landing in at an airport and people coming off the flight, there might be 200, 300 people on that flight. There's no way that you can keep that social distancing, because if you put 200 people in a lineup, we're already like two kilometers long. So really coming up with ways to make sure that people's behaviors are basically can be affected with wayfinding graphics and environmental kind of graphic solutions. And that might be something as simple as making sure that you put your displays, your passenger information displays, in areas where people can in fact either socially distance, or that there's no negative impact to the overall flows and user experience. But I mean, that question is, I think, something that all transit entities are struggling with right now, especially because of that decline of, like I said, in some cases up to 80%. So we're really hoping that this starts to pick up again, but we're also approaching some transit agencies, and we've been asked questions by other transit agencies on how that can be mitigated in the meantime. But it is a tough one because it's so unknown. We don't know how long. We don't know if it'll go away in a week, 2 weeks, a year, 2 years. So basically, it's something that we're working in real time with some of our clients to try to figure out. So hopefully that doesn't necessarily give you a straight answer to the question, but it's something I think everybody is kind of challenged with right now, and trying to find good solutions to get around that. So anyways, having said that, I think it's 5 minutes to 1 right now. So I just wanted to say thank you for all those who attended and took the time. I know everybody tends to be pretty zoomed out these days. So hopefully this was a pretty easy one, hopefully for you. And like I said, I look forward to, if there's any questions that come through, by all means. So thank you, and have a good day, everybody.